There is a woman lying in a museum drawer in Germany. She has been there since the 19th century. She was excavated from a burial site in Middle Egypt, wrapped in linen, preserved by 3,000 years of desert heat. For most of the time she has been in that drawer, she was considered a data point, evidence of a civilization, a culture, an identity that everyone assumed they understood. Ancient Egypt, African, continuous, unbroken, a people rooted in the soil of the Nile for millennia, whose descendants still live along that same river today. That is the version most of us carry. It is the version taught in classrooms, argued over in documentaries, claimed by competing nationalisms on multiple continents. It felt settled. It was not settled. In 2017, scientists extracted DNA from her teeth, from the teeth of dozens of mummies like her, drawn from the same burial site, spanning nearly 2,000 years of Egyptian history. What they expected and what they found were not the same thing. Not even close. The results pointed somewhere no one had fully anticipated. They forced a rethinking not just of who the ancient Egyptians were, but of how confidently that question had ever been answered. What the ancient DNA revealed about the people of the Nile is, in the most precise sense of the word, disturbing. Not because it is dark, because it was hidden in plain sight for so long. Before we go further, what did you already believe about where the ancient Egyptians came from? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you want more videos like this, subscribe now. The 2017 study published in Nature Communications by a team led by Verena Schunemann represents the first successful large-scale ancient DNA analysis of Egyptian mummies ever completed. The researchers worked with remains from the Abu Sir el-Malek archaeological site in Middle Egypt. Individuals who had lived at various points between roughly 1400 BCE and 400 CE, spanning from the New Kingdom through the Roman period. Before this study, the genetic identity of ancient Egyptians had been debated almost entirely on the basis of art, skeletal measurements, and historical records. DNA from mummies had proved notoriously difficult to extract cleanly, because the embalming chemicals and the heat that preserved the bodies also degraded the genetic material. The team's expectation, shared by much of the field, was that ancient Egyptians would show a genetic profile anchored in sub-Saharan Africa, the continent on whose northern edge this civilization had flourished. What the data actually showed was something fundamentally different. The ancient Egyptians in this sample clustered genetically with populations from the ancient Near East and the Levant, with people whose closest modern relatives live in what is now Turkey, Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. Sub-Saharan African ancestry was present, but at levels considerably lower than in modern Egyptians. These mummies, in genetic terms, looked less like people from deep within Africa and more like ancient farmers from the eastern Mediterranean world. That finding did not simplify the picture. It broke it open entirely. Because if the genetic foundation of ancient Egypt was rooted in the Near East, the obvious question becomes, how did it get there? To answer that, you have to leave the Nile Valley and travel back to a time when the Sahara did not exist as we know it. Between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, in what scientists call the African humid period, the region now covered by one of the world's most hostile deserts was instead a landscape of grasslands, shallow lakes, and seasonal rivers. People lived there. They hunted, fished, and moved across a green corridor that connected the Mediterranean coast to the heart of the continent. Ancient DNA extracted from prehistoric North African sites, including remains studied in research published in Science in 2018 and in Current Biology in 2023, has begun to reveal who those people were. What researchers expected was a relatively direct line from these ancient Saharan hunter-gatherers to the population that eventually built the pyramids. What the evidence suggests instead is a more complicated story. These early North Africans carried a genetic profile distinct from both later ancient Egyptians and from sub-Saharan populations. As the Sahara dried, a process that accelerated dramatically after around 5000 BCE, populations were compressed. They funneled into the Nile Valley and along the northern coast, and into that compressed, reshuffled population came another wave entirely. Neolithic farmers expanding westward and southward from the Levant. The people who would eventually become the ancient Egyptians were already a composite before the first pharaoh ever ruled. There is no pristine founding population at the origin of this civilization. There never was. Which raises an immediate question. If two populations were mixing in the Nile Valley during the Neolithic, did they mix evenly? Did they leave the same traces in fathers as in mothers? The answer is no. And the way scientists discovered this reveals something about how the Nile Valley was settled that no monument or inscription ever recorded. When researchers analyze ancient DNA for ancestry, they have access to two separate inheritance systems that work like parallel records. Mitochondrial DNA passes exclusively from mother to child, unchanged across generations unless a mutation occurs. The Y chromosome passes exclusively from father to son. By reading them separately, geneticists can reconstruct the maternal and paternal histories of a population independently. And sometimes those two histories tell completely different stories. In ancient Egyptian samples, they do. Mitochondrial lineages, the mother's record, show a distribution of haplogroups associated with both North African populations and Near Eastern Neolithic farmers, reflecting a relatively broad mixing of female ancestry from multiple source populations. The Y chromosome record, the father's lineages, tells a different story, with specific paternal haplogroups suggesting the incoming Levantine population movement was not gender symmetric. Research points toward a pattern in which the migration of Neolithic farming ancestry into the Nile Valley may have been substantially male-biased, meaning men from the Levantine farming expansion entered existing communities rather than entire family groups relocating together. The mothers carried one history, the fathers carried another. This kind of asymmetry appears in population replacements across the ancient world, and it rarely reflects peaceful, equal exchange. It reflects movement, directed, structured movement, in which people were not simply blending as neighbors. The civilization that emerged from this mixing was culturally unified. Genetically, it was already built on layers that did not sit evenly. By the time of the New Kingdom, the Egypt of grand temples, of campaigns into Nubia and the Levant, of pharaohs whose names became synonymous with power, the Nile Valley had been a settled civilization for over 1,000 years. The expectation, reasonable on its surface, is that this long-established empire would represent a genetically stable, relatively self-contained population. The genetic data from Abusir el-Melek mummies spanning this period suggests otherwise. Published research comparing ancient Egyptian genetic profiles to those of other Bronze Age Mediterranean populations has identified measurable affinity between New Kingdom-era Egyptians and ancient populations from the Aegean world, communities whose descendants are associated with early Greek civilization. Egypt at the height of its imperial power was not genetically sealed, it was connected. Trade networks stretched from the Aegean to Mesopotamia, and Egypt sat at the center of that web. Diplomacy brought foreign royalty to the Egyptian court. Military campaigns moved people, soldiers, captives, settlers, laborers, into and out of the Nile Valley at a scale that left a measurable genetic trace. The empire that projected absolute cultural continuity across its temple walls was, in biological terms, absorbing the wider Bronze Age world it dominated. Cultural unity and genetic stability are not the same thing. Ancient Egypt understood the first profoundly. It had no control over the second. And if the New Kingdom genome already reflected this Bronze Age connectivity, what happened in the centuries and millennia that followed was even more consequential. Here is what the Schooneman study found when it compared ancient mummy DNA to modern Egyptian DNA, and why that comparison matters more than almost any other finding in this story. Modern Egyptians carry significantly more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient mummies from the same region. The researchers estimated the difference at roughly 8%, meaning modern Egyptians carry approximately 8% more sub-Saharan African ancestry than their ancient counterparts from Abusir el-Melek. To put that in concrete terms, 8% of a genome is not a marginal rounding error. It is a meaningful, measurable shift, comparable in scale to the entire Scandinavian ancestry component detectable in modern British populations as a legacy of Viking Age settlement. Something moved the genetic needle in the Nile Valley between the ancient period and today. The historical record offers explanations. Trans-Saharan trade networks, which intensified significantly during the medieval Islamic period, moved people as well as goods along routes that had once been impassable desert. The medieval and early modern slave trade introduced new ancestry into North African populations at a scale that demographic research has consistently confirmed was genetically significant. These are not accusations. They are documented historical processes with documented genetic consequences. But the consequence for our understanding of modern Egyptian identity is direct. The people alive in Egypt today carry a measurably different genetic profile than the people who built the monuments that define Egyptian civilization in the global imagination. That gap had never been quantified before 2017. The comfortable assumption of continuity, ancient Egypt to modern Egypt, one unbroken line, required actual evidence. The evidence, when it finally arrived, told a more complicated story. The Nile River runs roughly 1,000 miles from the first cataract near Aswan in the south to the Mediterranean Delta in the north. That distance is not merely geographic. In the ancient DNA record, it is genetic. Research examining the distinction between Lower Egypt, the delta region closest to the Mediterranean and the Levant, and Upper Egypt, the Nile Valley stretching southward toward what is now Sudan, has identified a gradient rather than a uniform population. Lower Egyptian ancient populations show a stronger Near Eastern and Levantine affinity, consistent with the geographic reality that the delta was the primary entry point for migration arriving from the northeast. Upper Egyptian populations present a more heterogeneous profile, with evidence of greater complexity and, in some samples, proportions of ancestry that reflect deeper connections to populations further south along the river. The interaction between ancient Egyptians and the ancient Nubians, the people of the kingdoms to the south, who were distinct, politically independent, and in frequent contact with Egypt through trade, conflict, and intermarriage, left its own genetic trace. During the 25th dynasty, roughly 747 to 656 BCE, rulers of Nubian origin controlled Egypt itself, commanding an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to deep in the African interior. The genetic consequences of centuries of this kind of interaction are visible, if not yet fully mapped, in the Upper Egyptian record. The civilization that presented a unified face to the world was, along the length of its own river, genetically varied. Every claim about what ancient Egyptians looked like or where they came from that treats them as a single population is, by definition, incomplete. Pull all of it together, and the picture that forms is not the one anyone started with. The Schunemann 2017 study revealed that ancient Egyptian mummies clustered genetically with Near Eastern and Levantine populations, not with Sub-Saharan Africa, as most had assumed. Research on Green Sahara populations established that the people of the Nile Valley were already a composite before the First Dynasty, the product of compressed, rerouted populations mixing with incoming Neolithic farmers from the east. The maternal and paternal DNA records diverged, pointing toward an asymmetric, male-biased population movement during the Neolithic that left the two sexes carrying different ancestral histories. New Kingdom mummies showed Bronze Age Mediterranean connectivity, genetic evidence of an empire that absorbed the world it touched. The comparison between ancient and modern Egyptians revealed a measurable increase in sub-Saharan African ancestry in the modern population, driven by medieval and post-medieval population movements that reshaped the Nile Valley long after the pharaohs were gone. And from south to north, along the river itself, Upper and Lower Egypt were not genetically identical. They were a gradient, reflecting different migration histories, different contact zones, different points of entry. What emerges from all of this is not a single answer to the question of who the ancient Egyptians were. It is the dismantling of the premise that a single answer was ever available. The civilization was real. The culture was unified and extraordinary. But the genome beneath it was always in motion, always layered, always more complicated than the monument suggested. The disturbing part was never the complexity. It was the certainty that preceded it. She is still in that drawer in Germany, the woman from Abusir el-Malek, 3,000 years out of the desert, linen-wrapped, teeth intact enough to yield the data that changed the question. When scientists extracted her DNA, they were not looking for a political verdict. They were looking for a genome. What they found was a record of movement, of populations that crossed the Sinai and sailed the Mediterranean and pressed south along a great river for thousands of years before anyone wrote anything down. Her mitochondrial lineage connected backward to farmers she never knew existed, people who had never seen the Nile, but whose descendants eventually built temples along its banks. Her children, if she had them, inherited a history she could not have named. The civilization she lived inside called itself eternal, carved that claim into granite, sealed it in tombs designed to last forever. The DNA tells a different story, not of eternity, of motion, of a population that was never fixed, never pure, never the settled, continuous thing that 2 centuries of competing nationalisms needed it to be. That is what is genuinely disturbing about what the ancient DNA revealed. Not that ancient Egyptians were connected to the Near East, or that modern Egyptians carry a different ancestral profile, or that the Nile was a corridor rather than a container. What is disturbing is how confidently the wrong answer was given for so long by so many people without ever reading the bones. The genome was waiting in the tombs the whole time, patient, precise, indifferent to what we needed it to say.